Well, good evening, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Hope our technology.
Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you this week. Amazing. All right. I've got you. I think everybody got muted, but if you want to ask a question or anything, feel free to unmute yourself. We will not go 2 hours like we did last week. Sorry about that. Just getting started and had a lot to cover. So should be, I don't know, half that or so this week. We're looking at Chapter 2, the special education process from initial identification to the delivery of services. So I'll just tell you right from the beginning, if you have any questions or anything you want to talk about, I'll hang around as long as we need to afterward to answer any questions or anything like that. I should have everything graded in the next day or two for the first week and let everybody get on to the second week, knowing more what we're looking for since you've had the first week graded. So we're looking at Chapter 2, the special education process from initial identification until the delivery of services. We talked last week, and there were actually a lot of comments about, wow, there are only 13 categories that people can get in, and other people commented, well, their categories are very broad, so, how do I know? And then we had some people concerned, well, Down syndrome ought to have its own category. Well, kids with Down syndrome fall in under the intellectual disability category. So they get in if they meet the need. And remember, we said there's a two-pronged test. You have to have a disability that fits one of those 13 categories. And then in addition to that, you have to have an educational need. So, obviously a person with an intellectual disability, if they qualify for that, will have an intellectual need and therefore a difficulty in learning, so that comes along with that. And at the end of tonight's webinar, we're going to talk about the normal curve. That's really not part of our book, this chapter, but I think it gives a good theoretical and realistic view of what's going on in this whole special education process. So we'll jump into what the book says, and then we'll also talk about some of the things that I think are important. So when we look at how are students with disabilities identified, well, obviously, if we're going to get them into special education, we have to identify who needs special education. And this is done with a full team of people. It's not just, I can't just go up and say, hey, this kid, I really don't like him in my class. I want him in special education. There's a whole lot that goes into it. There may be some screening tests that are used, but there are definitely going to be some informal and formal assessments that are utilized with that. So we're going to talk about what is a multidisciplinary team. Well, a multidisciplinary team would include people from, as it says, many different disciplines. So you might have a diagnostician, you might have a regular educator, you might have a a special educator. Your regular educator is your general educator. You might have a special educator. You might have a specialist, especially if we're talking something like a visual impairment or a child who has a hearing impairment, auditory impairment. Then you'll have specialists in those areas that are going to come in and help work on this assessment to make sure that these students are identified. And in informal assessments, that's you as a teacher. You realize something's just not quite right with this kid. And so you're informally looking at that. You're also informally assessing your students, throughout the day. How are they interacting with peers? Do they get along well with others? Can they communicate well with you? All of these things, you know, although they don't get a grade for them, it's not, you know, it's not the STAR test or anything, but you're constantly assessing these students. It's a little bit like when you go out to meet someone, you know, you're informally assessing them all the time. You may ask them questions about their personal life. You may ask them questions about other things, you know, what they do for a living, those sorts of things. And all this time, you're making an informal assessment or an informal judgment about them. You know, I don't think any of you are going to show up at the local bar and whip out an intelligence test and say, here, dude, take this before I decide if I'm going to go out with you, you know. But informally, you're asking questions and you're like, oh, man, this guy just not real bright. I don't think he's my type or whatever else. You're making judgments based on what you observe with the people. Formal assessments are more usually paper and pencil type tests or computer-based tests more often now, but it's where you take a formal test, and those are either what we call criterion referenced or norm referenced. And criteria reference means that you have to make a certain score in order to pass. Most of the time we consider if you know 70% of that material, you get 70% of the questions right, then you have met the criteria to pass that test. A norm reference test, on the other hand, compares you with other people. The most obvious norm reference test that we all are familiar with is testing your vision. These are pair of readers here, $5 at Walmart, you know, help me see things close up, but I can see pretty well far away without these. But we use the term 20/20, right? And I've had people come up to me and say, I've got perfect vision, it's 20/20. Well, no, that's not perfect vision. That's normal vision. What the 20/20 means is at 20 feet, you see what the average person sees at 20 feet. So it's norm reference. You get a bunch of people in there, you say, hey, can everybody see this from 20 feet away? And that's kind of how they came up with that test. What can the normal person see from 20 feet away? Why is it not perfect at 20/20? Well, some people actually see better than that. Some people have 20/10 vision, which means that at 20 feet, they see what the normal person sees at 10 feet away. And then you might have a vision that needs to be corrected because it's 20/50 or 2100. Well, 2100 means that you see from 20 feet what the normal person sees 100 feet away. So that is an example of something that is norm referenced. When we give IQ tests, those are norm reference tests. When you give a test in school where you're measuring your the content and measuring what you have learned, and there's a passing score that's set for that, that's a criterion reference test. The STAR test is a criterion reference test. You have to score a perfect, not a perfect score, you have to score a certain score on that in order to pass. So when does this identification happen? I think we mentioned last week that students with very severe, before they're students, children, babies with severe disabilities are usually identified early by physicians or parents. You know, some kids are, as soon as they're born, the nurses or the doctor realize that there is a problem here. And those students are identified immediately. All infants, toddlers, and preschool children who have a disability or are at risk for developing a disability are entitled to special education services. So for our kids with more severe disabilities, they can begin receiving special education services even before their school age. We have ECI, Early Childhood Intervention, which is a program that's nationwide, federally funded, and that starts getting services for children before they're even school age, as soon as we find out there's a disability. I think we talked that IDEA has a requirement for child find. Well, that means that we have to actually actively search for students who live in our district who would qualify for special education. That's why school districts build relationships with hospitals and local pediatricians, so that when a child has a disability that the doctor finds out about, they can refer them to get help from the local school. So we've talked about with many of these disabilities, the sooner you can start working with that child, the faster they're going to be able to get up to, hopefully up to par with their peers, but at least get closer to maximize their potential, not keep getting further and further behind. So that good information to have, but doesn't really affect you as a teacher. Well, if I were teaching this class face-to-face, I would ask the question, how many of you are planning to be special education teachers? And there's a few of you who would raise your hands, but most of you, no, I'm not planning to. And then I would tell you, as soon as you walk in that school, you are going to be a special education teacher, because most of our special education students are not served in isolated classrooms anymore. They are in general ed classes. A lot of our kiddos, before we even realize they have a disability, they're in our general education classes. So especially if you're going to be an elementary school teacher, you're going to have students who are in your class who have not been identified as having a disability, but you are going to be one of the first to realize there's a problem here. So when a teacher starts to notice that a child is significantly behind their peers in academics or behavior, those kinds of things, then you might begin to realize there might be a problem here. So before a referral is done, and a referral is the actual formal move towards special education services, before that referral is done, you're going to begin to gather data on this student. And you're going to have grades, you're going to have papers, you're going to have handwriting samples, you're going to have all of these different academic assessments that you have, but you're also going to have informal information. You know, sometimes it starts off with, you know, something just doesn't seem right. Now, something doesn't seem right doesn't get you into special education, but it might be a start toward this whole pre-referral process where we begin to look and see, is there a problem? So in the pre-referral assessment, you're going to begin to gather data. If you are in a team teach situation, or you're in a school where kids, you know, go to different classes, and obviously normally that doesn't happen for our little bitty ones until, except for things like physical education or music or art or these other things that we do for the kids. And one of the reasons that we do those things for the kids is otherwise you wouldn't get a break. You would be with them all day, every day. So they'll go to these special classes like music, art, PE, those sorts of things. And that's when you're going to get your planning period or conference period. But that's when you begin to suspect that there's an issue with a child, you're going to go talk to those teachers. Hey, are you seeing issues with little Jimmy here? It seems to me he's kind of behind. He's not getting along with his peers. His handwriting's horrible, you know, whatever the case may be. And you're going to get information from them as well. So what we're looking for is to make sure that whatever this issue is, it's not happening just in my classroom. This is something that's happening across the spectrum of classes that they're in. Might even, talk to the lunchroom monitors or other people who would be around the child when you're not, see if they're seeing the same sorts of things. Then you're going to provide pre-referral intervention. These are required by law to be research-based techniques. So obviously most of what you're doing in the classroom is going to be research-based. You might not know the research behind it, but if you're being taught a particular method, then you can be pretty sure that there's some research behind that method. And if your district requires you to use a special method or materials or whatever, then there's probably research behind that. So what you're going to do is start looking at different interventions that might help this student to perform without having to go into special education. Response to intervention is one of the one of these research-based interventions that can be used, and we'll talk a little more about response to intervention. I can't remember if it's the next slide or let's see. No, but we'll talk more about it on some slide here in a minute. You're going to observe, and you know, this may be, there may be someone who you're going to talk to about this, especially as a young teacher. You're not, or a teacher without a lot of experience, you're not necessarily going to know what's normal and what's not. Most of us, when we get into schools, we have a very limited scope of what's normal. We usually think about our own childhood, our own brothers and sisters, kids that we knew in school, or if we're a parent, we will compare these kids with my kids. And of course, my kids are smarter, but you know, and you're going to maybe get someone else involved in this observation, where you're going to be looking at the frequency of these types of behaviors, the duration of these types of behaviors, maybe a time sampling. And the time sampling, you know, let's say you have a child who stutters, for example. Then in a time sampling, you would count the number of times that a child stutters, say, in a 5-minute period. And, you know, a lot of people, well, how do I teach school while I'm counting this kid stutters? Well, there's a lot of different methods that you can use. One of the things I used to do when I would usually count more things having to do with behavior than academics, but I would put a bunch of paper clips in my right coat pocket. And then every time the child did a particular thing, I would move one of those paper clips over to the left pocket. And at the end of that 5 minutes, I would count up the number of paper clips, and I would know how many times that child had stuttered during that 5-minute period. And then you can set your watch for 45 minutes later. I'm going to sample again for 5 minutes, see if this is still happening. But much of what you're going to do at this stage is, as we talked about in the informal part, it's very anecdotal. You know, something doesn't seem right. I keep seeing this particular issue happening. You know, can be anything from he makes his B's backwards, which, you know, a lot of little kids do that. So if that's your big issue, is that this kid sees, puts his B's backwards, then depending on what grade, you know, if this is a first grader, probably not a problem. If it's a kindergartner, definitely not a problem. But if it's a 5th grader, there may be an issue here. So those are the types of things you're going to take into account as you're checking this. And then, you know, frequency. Does this happen all the time? Is this something that, you know, every time I ask him to make a D, he makes a B, or is it just once in a while he gets his little, you know, D's and B's backwards? All those things are things you're going to look at as you're looking at these learning differences that may end up being special education needs. When you are making observations, be aware that your presence is changing that behavior. If you're the teacher that's in that with the child all day, every day, they're used to you. So after a while, your presence is really not changing things at all. However, if you're going in for the purpose of making an observation, Some of you will be doing that as part of your training. You'll go in and observe in classes. Understand that your very presence has changed the dynamic in that classroom to some degree. When you're reporting behavior or when you're reporting observations, you want to avoid things like always and never. There are very few things that people always do or that they never do. I especially think that this is important when you're observing behavior and then reporting the behavior. For example, middle school had a teacher that worked for me, and I would get a discipline referral, and it would say, you know, Susie is always talking in class and she never does her homework, was a discipline referral I get. So, you know, I walk over there to Mr. Rodriguez's class and I look in the door. Well, Susie's not talking. So always talking is not accurate. And then I said, okay, Mr. Rodriguez, you said that she never does her homework. Can you look in your grade book and tell me how many of assignments you've had and how many has she done? Well, I've had 12 assignments and she's only done 4 of them. So is it true that she never does her homework? No, it's not true that she never does her homework. She did 4 of the assignments. So we need to make sure that when we're reporting behaviors, whether that's academic behavior or disciplinary type behaviors, that we're using accurate language. Try to gather data for frequency and or duration and then report with data. What Mr. Rodriguez could have accurately said was, 3 times today in class, I had to tell Susie to stop talking. Susie has only done 4 of the 12 homework assignments for this 6 weeks. It's very accurate. It doesn't sound at all judgmental. And as a principal, I'll tell you, when I would call Susie's mom and say, hey, Mr. Rodriguez said that Susie's talking in class all the time and that she never does her homework, Susie's mom is going to say, you know, Timmy, Susie's older brother, had Mr. Rodriguez and he didn't like him either. You know, so it becomes a matter of he said, she said, and the teacher doesn't like him, and it's a personality conflict and all this, where if you just stick to the data when you make your reports, then you don't sound like you're a teacher who's trying to get a kid out of your room or trying to get a kid out in trouble or those sorts of things. One of my observations when being a principal is that somehow, some way, apparently some schools don't, some colleges don't explain to people who want to be teachers that there are going to be kids in those schools, because we have people that are teaching school who don't like kids. And I'm thinking, were they not warned when they became a teacher that they would be teaching kids? I mean, you know, if you don't like kids, then you need another job. Being facetious, but only a little bit, because I have had those teachers. All right, moving on. What are criterion reference tests? We said there are criterion reference tests and then there are norm-based tests. Well, a criterion reference test focuses on the student's mastery of particular content. Whatever the criteria is set that we're going to score this amount to show that we've mastered this content. So if teachers are developing these, you need to identify the skill that you want to know if this child understands. You know, maybe I want to know, do my students know that there are 13 original colonies? When I get ready to make a test, I may want to test, do my students know that there are 13 special education categories? And in Texas, what are they? So I'm identifying a skill that I think it's important for you to know. Then I'm going to task analyze that. Well, task analysis is to break something down. If you're breaking down a behavior, for example, you might break down the skill of getting the teacher's attention. Well, if I'm trying to teach a kid the appropriate way to get the teacher's attention rather than just holler, hey, teacher, you know, if I'm trying to get them to get the skill. And to me, that skill is you're going to look at the teacher to make sure the teacher's not busy. And then you're going to raise your hand, and then you're going to be quiet with your hand raised until the teacher acknowledges you. So I've broken that down into steps. Well, if I'm breaking down the 13 original colonies, how do I analyze that? Well, you've got to memorize or come up with a list of the 13 or the 13 disability categories. Identifying the skill is knowing those categories. Then you develop test items to measure the objectives. So if I listed, say, which of these is one of the disability categories in Texas, and I said ADHD, Asperger's, parentally impaired, or learning disability, which one of those is actually one of the categories that we use in Texas? Well, it's learning disability. Though the first two that I mentioned are actual real things, they fall under, ADHD falls under other health impairment. Now, you will run into children who you swear are parentally impaired, and you may be accurate about that, but that in and of itself will not qualify for special education. And you determine the performance criteria. Okay, I'm going to give this test here in a couple of weeks. I've already determined that if you get 70% of it, then that's going to be a passing grade. You're going to get a C. If you get 80%, you're going to get a B. If you get 90%, you're going to get an A, and I will consider that you have really mastered that. Then I administer and I interpret the test. What does it mean to interpret a test? Well, if I look and all the students miss a particular question, if every student misses a question, then one of two things is happening. Either one, that is a very discriminating question that is awfully difficult, I mean, to the point that nobody even guessed correctly, or I didn't teach that. It wasn't in the book. It came out of left. It wasn't something I should have held you accountable for. So at that point, I may need to throw that question out. It could be that I asked the question incorrectly. I've seen tests before where a teacher made a test and they put down 4 answers and none of the answers was correct. So in those kinds of cases, you really need to analyze the test that you've given, interpret the responses, and make sure that it works. Now, there are also some commercially produced tests out there. With the book that we have, I have access to a test bank, and I can pull test questions from there. When you give the STAR test or you give an end of course exam or anything like that, then those are commercially produced tests. Somebody has to pay for them. Usually the school district is paying for them. But criterion reference tests are not norm referenced. You're comparing the student's mastery to a particular criteria, not comparing the student to another student. All right, so what's a curriculum-based assessment? Well, curriculum-based assessment is a measure of the student's achievement level in terms of the expected curricular outcomes of the school. Teachers evaluate skill acquisition based on the curriculum being used. So I know that I'm going to be teaching a unit, say, on Lewis and Clark, and the school district already has a test made up that is going to test the student's knowledge of the explorers Lewis and Clark. Well, that is a curriculum-based assessment because I'm supposed to teach the unit on Lewis and Clark, and if I've taught that right, then at the end of the term or end of that unit, then the student should be able to pass a test on Lewis and Clark that's based on that curriculum. One of the things you're going to want to do with teaching and testing is when you get the test back, don't just look at what they got wrong, look at why they got it wrong, how they got it wrong. This is a process called error analysis. It's especially relevant in math. Now, if you give a test, and the first question is, what is 2 plus 2? And the kid writes 4, and the next question is, what is 2 plus 3? And the kid writes 6. And you continue to see a pattern like that, you realize, oh, when he sees a plus sign, he's multiplying. So I'm analyzing the errors to figure out how they got that particular question wrong. And then I will know how to teach. I need to go and go over again the difference between a plus sign and the X that's the multiplication sign, or later the dot that becomes the multiplication sign, or even the number and then the number inside parentheses. All these different things mean multiply. But if you're a kid and you don't know all those symbols, then you might have issues that make some of these same errors. So error analysis can help you figure out what's going on and what the issue is. So in your analysis, you're going to look at overall, how did each question do? And then individually, what did this particular student do to get that wrong answer? And is there a pattern to that? It could be just, they got it wrong. But there could be a pattern that you will find that will help you know what to reteach. One of the things that you can use on this, because it's not always as simple, obviously I gave a very simple example of the plus sign and the multiplication sign being mixed up. But one of the strategies you can use is a think aloud strategy. Ask the child, and of course, to do this, you're going to have your other kids busy. You're going to have to get some one-on-one time with this particular child, which sounds easy enough unless you're in the classroom. Then it's going to be, you're going to find out that's a very challenging thing to do. But you get that child alone and you have them work these similar problems to the one that you saw they had an issue, and you ask them what they're doing. What are you doing when you do that? Let them talk through their strategy, talk through the way that they're solving that problem or completing that skill. In multiplication, you're going to find that some kids, if you ask them what's 5 times 2, some kids are going to say, well, that's 10, and you say, how do you know that? Well, I memorized it. They've learned their math facts and they've memorized it. Another child say, what is 5 times 2? They say 10. Well, how do you know that? Well, if you take 5 and you do it 2 times, 5 plus 5 is 10. So they've learned that strategy. Another child, what's 5 times 2? Well, it's 10. How do you know that? Well, 5 times 2 is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So I've come up with 3 different ways there that this child is getting the correct answer. They all got the right answer, so it looks like they all know things just the same, when in fact, all of those are quite different skills. The child that's doing this, what's going to happen when they run out of fingers, when the numbers get bigger. So you've got to start working on different strategies that are going to help that child to do, and you're not going to know what strategy they're using without some sort of a think aloud strategy. One of the things that you can do in helping with this is when you're demonstrating a problem on the board, talk through it. This is what I'm doing. This is how I'm doing this. All right. Said we would get into the RTI model, response to intervention. This is kind of a school-wide model, or should be a school-wide model of screening and decision-making. This is, instead of me as a teacher on my own trying to figure out what's wrong with these kids and trying to identify which kids have an issue and potentially a learning disability or some other special education need, we're going to let this RTI model kind of catch our kids for us. So the RTI model, you have your first here, which is general instruction for everybody. Whatever I'm doing for my whole class, that's tier 1. And there are different models of this, so don't take my tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 as literal. Whatever school you work in may have different, but just basically overall there are different tiers. And so in my model, we're going to say tier 1 is the general instruction that all kids are getting. Tier 2 is, I realize that even with the general instruction I'm giving all kids, there's a few kids over here and they're not understanding what I'm teaching. So I'm going to kind of pull them aside, and we're going to make a Dr. C's lunch group. And on Tuesdays, Dr. C's lunch group going to get their lunch. They're going to come in my classroom, and at lunchtime, I'm going to work with them because they didn't get what I taught everybody else. 80% of the kids got it. These kids didn't quite get it. And so I'm going to work with them individually. That's tier 2. It's a little more. And then I realized that with my tier 2 intervention plus my tier 1 intervention, almost all of my kids in my lunch group got it except for one. And as I'm working with him, I realized, he's just not understanding. So there's something more going on. Well, at that point, then we're going to move into a tier 3, which is some extra help. It could be that we have another teacher coming in doing intervention with that child. Sometimes the way I explain something, somebody doesn't get it, and then you can explain it. Oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. So when we do a tier 3 intervention, it may be somebody else. It may be that we're sending this child down to another classroom where they're getting extra help on that. But if even that's not helping, then we got to start looking, is there something more serious going on? And at that point, we'll have to start looking at the possibility of referral for special education. This model can also be used for behavior. When you lay out your rules, your expectations, most of the kids are going to comply with that. Most of the kids are going to do what you want them to do. Especially younger kids, they want to please the teacher. Middle school kids, gets a little more iffy. And then when you get into high school, and most of the kids are figuring out, hey, I need to do this to graduate, and they'll come around for the most part. But you've got some kids that even with all the rules, everything you're doing, they're not getting it. They're not behaving the way they need to. So I'm going to do some interventions. I'm going to start working particularly with these couple of kids that are still giving me grief in my classroom. And that's going to require some extra time. I might need to come up with an extra plan for them. Say, hey, Victoria, I appreciate the fact that you're always here in class, but we've got to really do something about the way you get out of your desk and jump around every now and then. Something's just not quite right with that. You're disturbing those around you. So tell you what, when you think you need to do that, you just kind of wave to me and then turn your video off, and then you can jump up and do whatever you need to do, and then sit back down, turn your video back on, and that'll be a secret between you and me. We know that you did that, but nobody else needs to know that. We really don't want them to see it. So that's an intervention that I've worked out with Victoria and me. So when she needs to get up out of her chair and jump around, she can do that. Now, obviously, that's something that we're talking about on a visual or virtual type of thing, but you can work out the same sorts of things with kiddos in the classroom. I used to, have a kid that just was ADHD as he could be, and you could tell when he was getting real antsy and he needed to move. Well, you can write a note, and I'd take my little notepad and I'd write a note, and I'd say on there, dear Mrs. Smith, Joey has the wiggles. He needs to burn off some energy. Would you please initial this and send him back? And then I would take that and I'd fold it over and I'd staple it so that Joey couldn't see it. And I'd say, Joey, take this down to Mrs. Smith and wait for an answer. So he'd go down the hall to Mrs. Smith's room. He'd Miss Smith would open it up and she'd know exactly what I'm talking about. And so she would initial and she'd fold up, she'd staple it. Okay, Joey, here's my answer to Dr. C. Take that back to him. Well, that's given that kid an opportunity to work some wiggles out, but he feels important. He doesn't feel embarrassed. He feels like, wow, I got to do something for the teacher. So instead of being a troublemaker, he's a helper, and we make a huge difference. But we all know that no matter all of those interventions that we have in place, that there are going to be some kids who just can't follow the rules or just won't follow the rules. And so different harsher interventions are going to come in to the point that eventually a child might be removed from the normal regular class, normal regular school, and end up at a disciplinary alternative educational placement. Certainly we don't want that to happen, but that can be like the last step during this RTI model for behavior. All right, how is eligibility for special education services determined? Remember, only students who meet the eligibility criteria for one or more of our categories may be considered for special educational services under IDEA. Now, this is where RTI is a good program. Through RTI, you can get a lot of interventions for kids who don't qualify for special education under IDEA. One of the reasons for that is part of IDEA funding comes from federal tax dollars, federal government spending. RTI doesn't. That's part of your local school budget. And so those kiddos don't have to be identified as having a particular disability. They just have to be identified as needing help. So RTI can be a great help in those situations. One of the caveats that we have in trying to identify a disability is if there's a lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math, or if they have limited English proficiency. Several of you commented on the Diane case, and I'm glad you picked up on that. I mean, how horrible. You know, we give a little girl who speaks only Spanish, we give her an IQ test in English and say, oh, she's retarded. You know, that was the term that was used back then. I'm not being crude. That was the term that was being used, and they said that she was mentally retarded because she didn't do well on a test in English. Well, you know, give me a test in Swahili, I won't do well on it either, and I will show up as having an intellectual disability or being retarded or whatever other term you want to call me. I'm in deep doo-doo. So if a child has limited English proficiency, you know, I'm rereading this sentence, and there's a huge flaw in this sentence. This is from the book. There's a huge flaw there. You can have a disability and be limited English proficient if you're tested in the correct language. So I should have caught that earlier and changed this. And because of this, there are a huge number of educational diagnosticians now in Texas who are bilingual. They usually get an extra stipend, and they can give tests in English or in Spanish. And certainly there are tests available in other languages, but you know, Texas, with the majority of our students being Hispanic, then we have a lot of Spanish speakers who have limited English proficiency. If they're limited in their English proficiency, but they also have a disability, they can qualify for special education services. I think what they're meaning is they can't be considered to have a disability because they have limited English proficiency. That's a more accurate way to say it. Now, we've dealt with the last part of that, but let's deal with the lack of appropriate instruction in reading and math. Let's say that we've got a child who moves into our school, and mom says that he's been homeschooled for the last 5 years, which is perfectly legal in the state of Texas. You can homeschool your children. But many of our parents who say they homeschool their children actually are just keeping them at home, and the parents are going to work, and these kids really are not getting any sort of education. So then the kid comes in, and guess what? He's 5 years behind his peers in math. He's 5 years behind his peers in reading. and you start seeing, oh man, I think there's a learning disability here. But you start asking these questions, talking to the parent, talking to the kid, and you realize, you know what? This kid has never had the instruction. He never learned to add and subtract, never learned to multiply and divide, never learned, you know, she would put on hooked on phonics on the VCR or the DVD, but wasn't really getting instruction in it. That cannot be considered a disability. They have to have had the instruction and still not be able to understand it. So you might get some kiddos like that who have not had proper instruction. One of the places that we see this really show up is with our kids with emotional and behavioral disorders. One of the problems that they have is they act bad in school so much that they end up getting suspended. And because of all the time they've spent being suspended, they've missed out on a ton of instruction because they've been either in school suspension or been suspended at home, or they've been sitting in the principal's office and they missed the lesson, so they never got an opportunity to learn that concept. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the unit on emotional disturbances. But one of the things we really need to consider, and this is where RTI or some other process can really come in handy, is that when we start giving these students that we suspect may have a disability, but they haven't ever had the training or had the instruction, then we can, through the RTI, give them more intense instruction. And there are a lot of ways to do that. Some are good, some are bad. One of the things you don't want to do is, you know, take away all the fun classes from a kid. Okay, kid, I know that you're really excelling in athletics and you really love that. Or the school that I used to be in, the ag program was huge, and the kiddos could take ag as a class. But the first thing that they would do if a child was having trouble, you know, passing the math test, they would pull them out of ag and give them another math class. Well, the kid already hates math. And now you tell me I got to go to math twice a day and I don't get to go to ag at all. You know, obviously something like that may have to happen, but you're going to be a lot better off if you can come up with more creative ways to get the student the extra instruction they need without making them hate coming to school from the get-go. All right, we've talked about these. We've seen them. You're going to see them again. We'll see them over and over. Want to talk not only about what our categories in Texas are, but the abbreviations for them. Autism is abbreviated AU. So you might get a child in your class and you'll just have an AU label over there instead of them writing out autism. Deaf blindness. If you saw the pie chart in the spreadsheet that I put under the resources for the state of Texas numbers for 2019 and 2020, 1920 school year, you saw that there are very few deaf blind kids in the state. I think it was less than 100. I don't remember off the top of my head, but you are not going to have one of these kids in your class. You know, there aren't that many in the state. The next one is non-categorical early childhood, abbreviated NCEC, or initialized NCEC. And this is a category that we're going to see less and less of. I told you last week that this was a category where you had to kind of suspect that they had a learning disability or suspect that they had intellectual disability. Well, the rules are changing on that, and now beyond suspecting it, you got to prove it up. So this is a category that we're going to see districts going further and further away from. And if you're going to go through all of the problem to say, I suspect there's a learning disability and here's all the information where I've proved it up, you might as well say that they have a learning disability. Emotional disturbance, or ED, auditory impairments, we've always called that AI in Texas. That name is changing. Any new law, any new legislation or regulations that come out is going to call that deaf or hard of hearing. Anybody got a guess why? Well, the deaf and hard of hearing community wants it that way. They don't like the word impairment. They say, I'm not impaired, I just can't hear. I can still communicate. I talk to all my friends in sign language in various ways. So that's going to change over to deaf or hard of hearing, and that may be the way that it is before y'all get into your teaching jobs. So I don't know how they're going to abbreviate that. Right now it's AI. I'm guessing it's going to be DHH or something like that. Next one is intellectual disabilities. That's abbreviated ID. And that's what we used to call mental retardation. Multiple disabilities or multiply disabled. You'll notice in the chart that I gave you from the state of Texas and then made the pie chart out of, you don't see this category there. And the reason that you won't is because it says that it is identifying these students by their primary disability. So this might be a child who is learning disabled, but also has an orthopedic impairment. He's learning disabled in math, but he has had an amputation, something like that. So the primary disability, the main reason he's in special education is because of that learning disability, not due to the fact that he has an artificial limb. Other health impaired, OHI. Remember, this is the category where our ADHD kids and other medical conditions like that are going to fall in there. And some people say, well, ADHD needs to have its own category. Well, I understand that, but OHI is kind of a catch-all for all of the different medically caused educational issues. So if we gave a category to all of those, there'd be tons of different categories, and they're actually medical diagnoses. So it works to have them just all fall under OHI. Orthopedic impairment is OI. These are kids who typically will use a walker or crutches or a wheelchair. Specific learning disabilities, we usually just call that LD. Oh, orthopedic impairment is OI. Specific learning disabilities, we call that LD. And normally those are in a particular area, usually in math or reading, something like that. Speech or language impairments, we call that SI. These are students who have, the obvious ones have a speech problem, whether that's stuttering or they don't say their O's white or something like that. Those sorts of things. But a lot of times along with that, there's a language issue where even though it may not be coming out correctly, or it could be coming out correctly, it's not processing right in the brain. Next one is traumatic brain injury, TBI. This was a kid who was born normal, and at some point after birth, suffered some sort of trauma to the head. This could be a bike wreck, it could be a car wreck, it could be a bullet that has caused brain injury and has given this child a disability. And then the last one there is visual impairments, and of course that includes students who are blind. All right, some common evaluation procedures, intelligence testing. One of the things that we want to do with our kiddos that we suspect might have either an intellectual disability or a learning disability is to test their IQ. IQ is a norm reference test. What we do is they test a lot of kids from all over the country, and it's actually a ratio. You take where they're performing and divide that by their chronological age. So if I'm reading like I'm 6th grade 3rd month, but I'm actually a 7th grade 3rd month, then I'm a year behind. And when you do all the multiplication, I'm going to come out about 10 points lower on the IQ test than my buddy. And achievement testing, there are achievement tests that are normed with the intelligence test. The intelligence test tells you what you ought to be able to do based on your brain power. The achievement test says what you are doing, or shows what you are doing, where you are achieving. And again, this is compared to your same age peers. You may have a developmental assessment. What is this child able to do? This happens a lot of times with speech and language. You know, at what age should a child be able to say the R sound without it being aw? You know, when does it become an actual regular R sound? Are they developmentally behind? This could also be, you know, skills like being able to throw a ball, or walk, run, all these different kinds of things, skip, all these different things that develop at a certain age or around a certain age. And certainly everybody's different, but there are kind of norms that most people are doing this at this point. So developmental assessment. And behavioral assessments is looking at bad behaviors, strange behaviors, disruptive behaviors, and assessing those. Those are often done with, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we get to behavior, because this is kind of my wheelhouse here. Is you want to look at the antecedents, you know, what's causing, what happens just before this behavior happens, and what behavior is there, and then what are the consequences of that behavior. And we find out that a lot of kids act bad, and the reason they act bad is it works. They've been able to get what they want for a long time by acting bad. So the consequences are, I act bad, I get what I want, good deal. All right, so once this child has been gone through all this tests and we say, yes, they qualify for special education, then we have an individualized education program developed for that child. And that's written by the IEP team, which in Texas we call the ARD committee. The rest of the country calls this the Individualized Education Program Team, or the IEP team. We call it the ARD committee. ARD's a great word. You know, it's one of those things that can be used in almost any part of speech. We have an ARD committee, so it's an adjective. I go to an ARD, so it's a noun. We ARDed that kid, so it's a verb. You know, it's kind of like the F word. It can be used in any part of speech just fine. The makeup of that committee includes the parents. So the parents must be invited. It includes at least one general education teacher. It includes at least one special education teacher. It includes a representative of the local education agency, and more specifically, it includes somebody who can commit to the district's use of resources. So this is normally going to be an administrator. And it includes the student whenever possible, especially when you get on into upper middle school or high school. There's a big push to have the students involved in their own education, be their own advocates, and have them being part of this committee. There's another person on there that I guess they're throwing under the special education teacher, or maybe under the representative local education agency, but there's someone who is able to talk about the educational implications of the testing if there was testing done. This would either be a school psychologist or a diagnostician who can take the test that's been given and say, okay, this is what's going on in this kid's head, and this is how that's going to affect their classroom performance. So when we look at that, what we see is that, well, okay, you want to be that way. That everybody's an expert. What do I mean by that? Well, okay, you have the parent. What's the parent the expert of? The parent is the expert in that they should know that child better than anyone knows the child. So the parent is the expert on the child. The general education teacher, what's she the expert in? The curriculum. If I've got a 7th grade general education teacher, she's going to be the expert on what these kids need to know in the 7th grade. The special education teacher, she's the expert, or he's the expert on modifications and accommodations that are allowable by law to help this child access the general education curriculum. Then the local education agency representative, that person is the expert on what funds are available. Can we do this? Do we have a program like this? Or, special education is not a one size fits all. We're not going to do the same thing for every child, but schools typically will come up with several different programs and find which one is the best fit for that particular child. But even that's dangerous. You really by law are supposed to be developing an individualized, the I in IEP, individualized education program. So for this particular student, I may say, okay, part of the day you're going to be in that program, part of the day you're going to be in that program, part of the day you're going to be in your regular ed class, and we'll see you at lunch. So you have that representative. Then you have the educational diagnostician or the school psychologist, who's also a representative of the LEA. And they're going to be able to explain to the parents, okay, on the test, we saw that he has a learning disability in reading. Okay, what this means for him, based on the scores that we got on this particular child, it means that he's going to have difficulty with some of the harder words. He may have difficulty pronouncing them. He may pronounce them just fine. He can sight read the words great, but his comprehension is an issue. So this diagnostician or school psychologist is going to be able to explain those. And then we have the student. The student is even more of an expert on what the student wants than the parent is, but the parent may be a little more objective about it. So everybody in the room is an expert on something or the other. Components of an IEP. Present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. We used to call these present levels of performance, and we would talk about PLOPs, present levels of performance. What are his PLOPs? Well, that didn't really sound good. So I guess they changed the law to keep us from saying PLOPs, and now we say present level of academic achievement and functional performance. That's one of the components of an IEP. It's where they are, all right? Then the measurable goals. Where are they gonna be? Where do we want them to be? Then how that progress is gonna be measured and how it's gonna be reported to the parents. Are they only gonna get a student report card just like everybody else? Normally with our special ed kiddos whose parents are involved, we're gonna report to them more often. I've seen it as often as daily. I've had some parents who have said, I want that teacher to email me after each class and tell me how that child did. Well, that's kind of ridiculous. That's going to take up a huge amount of time for that teacher. And we never want to say to the parent, well, she's got other kids to take care of, because obviously my kid is the most important to me. That's the only one that matters to me. But it's normally you're going to come up with a system where you're going to report to parents. When it's just a matter of grades, then it might be every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, once a week, something like that. If you've got a child that misses a lot of homework, it may, at the end of each week, you may send home all their homework, and the parent can help them get the homework done over the weekend. I'll probably talk more about my philosophy on homework later, but those sorts of things happen. Other times you're just going to say, you know what, I get a report card every 6 weeks, and then a mid-term every 3 weeks. That's good enough for me. What related services this child is going to have? Are they going to have a sign language interpreter? Are they going to have a special ed transportation? Perhaps they need that. Maybe a kid that's in a wheelchair needs the bus that has the wheelchair lift. Makes sense. So you're going to talk about all of those things, as well as supplementary aids and services. This might be some of the assistive technology we've talked about, like a communication board for kiddos who can't communicate verbally with others. Could be lots of different things that the kid is going to have in order to get the services that they need. This is written positively, participation in general education. The way the law is actually written, what you explain to the parent is how much they're not going to be participating in general education. So you would say, you know, they'll get half of their day will be in a general ed classroom, half of their day won't be, or something to that effect. It's a 6-period day, and they're going to have 4 periods in special ed classrooms, 2 periods in general ed classrooms, something like that. What accommodations they're going to get for testing. If you have a child who has a dyslexia that qualifies as a learning disability or something like that, they may get the accommodation of extra time on their testing. If you got a child who has a visual impairment and can't read the material, their accommodation might be for testing that somebody's going to read the test to them. You got a child who doesn't have good motor control. Their accommodation might be that they're going to do the test orally. Somebody will write their answers down for them. So all sorts of accommodations like that can be made. It's really only limited by the creativity of the IEP team. Dates of services. When is this going to start? You know, is this something we can put in place by tomorrow, or are we going to need a week to get everything together, and then we'll start them on Tuesday the 8th? You know, those are the things that we're going to look at and tell them when the dates of these services will begin. And if we know that these are going to end, you know, it might be a 3-week program that we're going to put them in, then when that will end. By the age of 16 or younger, if appropriate, we're also going to have a transition plan. You know, and you start this usually by asking the kid what they want to be when they grow up. You know, I had a kid that used to be in my class who was going to be in the NBA. He told me he wanted to be in the NBA. So every time we came up with a plan, his plan was, I want to be in the NBA. Only thing was, I'd seen him in the gym and I knew he couldn't play basketball worth a darn. So, you know, that's not a good plan. So we have to come up, okay, David, just in case you don't make it in the NBA, what's your backup plan? What's something we can work with? I was in a small town for a while where everybody wanted to be a veterinarian. Well, you know, if you aren't in regular general education science classes because of a learning disability, chances are you're not going to make it through the Texas A&M system veterinary school. So, you know, what's a more realistic thing? But if we have a child who wants to go to college, okay, what college readiness courses do we have? What can we do to help the child? And then we talk about the transfer of the rights at the age of majority. You know, by the time a lot of our kiddos are seniors, they're 18. They can stay up to the age of 22 in our schools. And at 18, they actually have parental rights over themselves. They have the right to accept these services or deny these services, and what they say then is more important than what the parent says. So you talk about that issue, the transfer of rights. The Individual Family Service Plan, the IFSP, this is what goes in place. It's like an IEP, but this is for our little bitties, the infants, the toddlers, and their families. You talk about the physical and cognitive development, the communication development, their social and emotional development, and their adaptive development. Adaptive behaviors are those behaviors that help us just get by in daily life. So not going to spend much time on that because, you know, that's all going to be taken care of before these kiddos get to you. Remember, when we're talking about all of this and trying to decide on the placement for the child, we're looking at least restrictive environment. And I've worked with people before who said, oh, I want them in the least restrictive environment, and that is the general ed classroom. Well, when IDEA talks about the least restrictive environment, it talks about the least restrictive environment appropriate for that child. So you mix in the free appropriate public education, that appropriate part, with the LRE. What's the most appropriate environment that's the least restrictive that works for this kid? Inclusion is not mandated by the IDEA. You'll have teachers tell you, well, by law, they have to be in the general ed classroom. No, No, by law, they have to be in the least restrictive environment that's appropriate for them. So we want to make sure that all of our schools have a full continuum of services. And when we look at this continuum, least restrictive, disregarding what's appropriate, least restrictive is in general ed instruction all day long. That's what most kids get. However, if you're in special education, there's a reason that you're in special education. You don't get it like everybody else gets it. So if you're going to be in general instruction all day long, you're going to need some sort of extra help. So you might be in general ed all day long, but have some special education assistance. You may have an aide that comes in with you sometime. You may have a co-teacher in there who's going to help you at times. You may have the opportunity to go out to a program called Content Mastery to get help whenever you don't understand things. So general ed with some special education assistance, that second bullet there, that is whatever we do for the kid to help them to be able to stay in the general ed classroom. Again, very preferable. If that's enough for that child, great. The next one, general ed along with the resource room services. This would be that they spend most of their time in a general ed class, but let's say they have a learning disability in math. They may go to a resource math class. Resource is typically a special education placement where for that child with the learning disability in math who can't handle the general education math class, they may be fine in English, social studies, all that other, but when it's time for math, they're going to go to the resource room to learn their math more at their level. Next is special education classroom in a regular school. This would be a kiddo who goes to the regular neighborhood school with everybody else, but spends his day or her day in a special education classroom that's inside that school. I was at a school today and they talked about, okay, we're going to have 2 RISE units. Well, RISE is the Fort Worth ISD setting for kids with severe, profound disabilities. So that's a special education classroom that's housed at a regular school. There are special education schools. There are schools where everybody that goes there qualifies for special education. That's usually your more severe, more profound issues. Next is a homebound or a hospital instruction. This is a child whose disability is so bad that they can't leave the house or they can't leave the hospital. So we can go to them in special education is one of the things that we can do. The last one there is instruction as a residential setting. And I've got a caveat there because that may be the most restrictive of the environments, but it may not. If they're in a residential setting, let's say they've been adjudicated into a state school. Is that considered by IDA to be a more restrictive environment? It's not. Even though it's very restrictive, I mean, they're locked up behind barbed wire. Special ed didn't put them there. A judge did. So this is where they would be, whether they had a disability or not, because they've been adjudicated into that setting. In those cases, that's not the type of residential setting that we're talking about that is most restrictive. This is the sort of thing that you have a child who has severe mental issues, let's say. Paranoid schizophrenia, where they totally lose touch with reality. They're a danger to themselves and others. And you say, as a school, we can't do anything for this child here. The issues are too big. Then as a school, if I say, parent, I want to put this child in this residential setting, the school has to pay for it. So huge commitment. You don't see that very often, but it can happen. Okay, that brings us to the normal curve. Can y'all see the mouse, the pointer cursor when I move it on that document? Okay, good. Because I couldn't find a chart that showed exactly what I wanted to show. But on the normal curve, this is the mean, the average. And on the Wechsler Intelligence Score, which is they call it the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Score for children, 100 is considered to be the average. When they did all of the norming, did all the testing and statistically ran the numbers, they said, okay, 100 is the average score on this. And our standard deviation means, our standard deviation is going to be 15. That means 15 points up is the standard deviation, 15 points down is a standard deviation. Now, there's a whole lot of statistical stuff that happens to come up with that standard deviation. But what it means to us is that from 85 to 115, 34% of people score between 100 and 115, 34% of people score between 100 and 85. Therefore, 68% of all people, about 2/3 of people, are going to score on an intelligence test between 85 and 115. Told you my wife is an educational diagnostician, and she jokes, but it's not really a joke, that within about 5 minutes of meeting you, she knows your IQ. She's been doing this for so long that she can talk to you for a few minutes and she will know what your IQ is. Now, sounds like magic, but I already know a whole lot about y'all, because the fact that you're in a college, a university, means that your IQ is probably somewhere around the 110. What we know is that people who go to college, the average IQ of people who go in college is more like 110 than 100. 100 is the general population. 110, those who go to college. So we know that your IQ is somewhere around here. You're almost one standard deviation above what's considered the average IQ. Now, we spread this out to another standard deviation. 115 plus 15 gets us to 130, and that takes in another 13.5%. So we're up to 47.5%, almost 48% of people. And almost 48% of people are going to fall between 100 and 70. So 95% of all people are going to have an IQ between 70 and 130. 95% of people are going to have that. We spread out one more standard deviation. We go to 145 down to 55, and now we have 99% of all people will fall between IQ of 145 and 55. All right. If we're looking for students who are considered intellectually disabled, ID, what we used to call mentally retarded, those IQs are going to be below 70. So in this range, here on down, that's where our kids who have intellectual disabilities are going to fall. Most kids who are autistic, IQs are in this range. Well, why don't we call them intellectually disabled? Well, because there's other things that go with autism other than just this IQ issue. And there are a lot of people who are autistic whose IQ is up here in the average range. So when we look at this, what does it mean? Well, the fact that this is our mean or our average means that half of all people IQ is below 100. Half of all people IQ is above 100. Let's go back to our example where we talked about the guy with 20/20 vision that told me his vision was perfect. Guy tells me he has a perfect IQ. My IQ is 100. It's perfect. Say, well, no, that's not perfect. That's an average IQ. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But I happen to know that there's no such thing as a perfect IQ, because it's not, you're not rated against a criteria, you're rated against other people. It's norm referenced. Typically, this area up here, if we're talking about students who are truly gifted and talented, they're going to be in this upper 2% or so. And if we had our percentiles out here and say, okay, I'm going up here, this is the 50th percentile. Means 50% of people have their IQ lower than that. If my IQ is 115, then I add 34 to the 50, I'm at the 84th percentile. Go up to 130, add the 13 and a half to your 84, you got, what is it, 97.5, I'm at the 97.5 percentile. By the time I get up here to 145, add that 2, I'm at 99.9th percentile. That means if I'm walking down the street and I meet 1,000 people, only one of those would have a higher IQ than I do. This line looks like it goes down here and actually meets the bottom line. Actually, it's asymptotic. It never reaches the line. It always gets closer. So theoretically, this goes on forever and never quite reaches that, which means I could have somebody with an IQ way out here, or I could have somebody with an IQ way down here. When you're looking on the internet, you're playing on Facebook and you see a clickbait or something that says, hey, people with an IQ less than 150 can't do this, you know, and then you can do it and you think you're really smart. Well, that is not a valid IQ test, okay? So don't think that you're super duper smart or highly intelligent or anything else. But what happens when we look at learning disabilities, and we'll talk about this when we actually get to that segment, but let's say you have a child and you give them an IQ test and their IQ is, let's say, 104. Okay, 104. That's not a bad IQ at all. You're actually above average in that. You're above the 100. You're above the mean. And then we give them achievement test and they score around this same thing in math, science, all this. And we get to reading and boom, their reading comprehension score is way down here. Okay, that's a pretty clear specific learning disability because they're not performing anywhere near their potential. Potential is here, performance is here. That is a learning disability. Especially if their achievement in all the other areas is around this same place, but that specific problem, they're scoring down here. So that's a little bit about the normal curve. If you'll keep this in mind, kind of look at it a while, it's going to really help you understand. You know, most of the kids that you're going to get, their IQ is going to be in this range here, the average range. We know that when we get into some really poor areas, that the kids that are in the public schools, their IQ is actually going to be, their average of the school-wide IQ is actually going to be down here on the bottom side of the mean. Just, you know, not talking politically or anything, that's just what the testing has shown. So with that in mind, it's going to tell you I'm going to have to do something different. If I know that kids that go to college usually have an average IQ around 110, and I know that my kiddos, they're going to need some extra help because you don't go to school based on your IQ. You never had to take an IQ test to get into Tarleton. What they wanted to see is how you achieved. Can I take a child whose IQ is down in here and help them achieve above here? Absolutely. Going to take some extra work. Going to take some, you know, they're going to have to work hard, and I'm going to have to teach them some strategies. But if they're willing, then we can help them do that. So I hope this helps explain a little bit about learning disabilities. And that's my final slide. So anybody have any questions for me?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Quinn, how are you?
So this might not be related to the assignment particularly or to the thing. I have not yet gotten my book yet,
Okay.
so it might still. I don't remember when exactly it's supposed to come in, but it was very late, whenever. So it might be a few more days before I get that.
I think we've got a lot of people in that same boat. With what you got tonight, you should have plenty to be able to answer the discussion and the reflections. I'll go ahead and type up the reflections tomorrow and post them since you don't have a book to see what they are. I'll go ahead and post them like I did last week, since I think there's still quite a few of you who don't have books yet.
Okay.
That work?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Good question. Well, I appreciate everybody being here. I hope that your semester has started off well, and feel free to contact me. Sorry about the not changing that due date on the thing yesterday. I think I caused a heart attack or two as somebody emailed me right quick and said, hey, I haven't done this, and it's already due 3 days ago. But I'll make mistakes, and we'll get through it. So, anything else? All right. Y'all have a great week. Holler if you need me.